Welcome. Thank you all for joining us today um, for conversations across continents, Philippine histories and memories in the Manuel papers. We are really excited to have this great group of panelists here with us today. And we're going to be talking about the sort of long path, the long journey of this really important archival collection from physical originals at the National Library of the Philippines and to this brand new collection online that results from those originals. And we'll talk much more about the details of that process. We are happy to be joined by people that participated both in preparing the materials and people who will speak with us about how these materials can be used, how important they are, and what this new collection presents in terms of possibilities for that use. We are sort of on an auspicious date. This is Quezon's birthday. That's why we chose the date. So we're happy that you're all here with us to celebrate today. Um, Dr. Ricky Punzalan will be leading the conversation, and at the end, we'll have a little bit of a chance to do some Q&A. So if questions bubble up for you as the speakers are speaking, jot them down. Feel free to share them through the Q&A or the chat with us, and we will, as time permits, ask those of the panelists at the end. At this moment, I would like to welcome Alexis Antrocoli, who is the director at the Bentley Historical Library, to say a few words to you.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Megan. And thanks to Ricky and to all our panelists for joining us today. We're really delighted to be hosting this event and also thrilled to have made this digital collection available. It was created from the microfilm of the original Manuel papers. And what you're going to hear about today is the result of decades of partnership between the Bentley Historical Library and the National Library of the Philippines, including the work of many archivists. Some of them are here with us today, and we're really grateful for their work. The original papers are housed at the National Library of the Philippines. And after Quezon passed away in 1944, the papers went there and a formal finding aid was created for the collection in 1968. And this happened to be at the same time that the University of Michigan was developing its Philippines collection, recognizing the research value of the material here that documented the US colonial period in the Philippines and what are deep and complex relationships between the United States and the Philippines, as well as the University of Michigan. The microfilm project was completed in 1969, and it was the result of a partnership between the National Library of the Philippines, the Bentley Historical Library, and the University of Michigan's Southeast Asian Studies Center. And the partnership took shape because all the parties understood how internationally significant this collection would be. And they took what was at the time a really unusual step to ensure the broadest possible access across the world in the way that was in the best possible way in the late 1960s, and that was microfilm. So today, the newly digitized collection is available for researchers now and in the future in their homes around the world, and we're really eager to see what comes next. And so I'm going to pass it back to Megan to get us started on the panel.
Okay. I will introduce Dr. Punzalan, and he will then introduce our panelists more specifically. A little bit more information about Ricky. He's an associate professor of archives and digital curation in the School of Information at University of Michigan. He holds a Ph.D. in information from the University of Michigan, along with graduate certificates in science, technology, and society and museum studies, and earned his BLS and MLIS degrees from the School of Library and Information Studies at the University of the Philippines, Diliman. He previously taught at both the University of the Philippines Silliman School of Library and Information Studies and the University of Maryland College of Information. He served on the Society of American Archivists Council from 2018 to 2021 and again in 2025 to 2026. He served as chair of the Native American Archives section from 2017 to 2018 and co-chair of SAA's Archival Repatriation Committee from 2022 to 2025, where he led the drafting of the principles in Indigenous archival repatriation in 2025. He's currently the Board of Trustees of the Library of Congress American Folklife Center. Ricky Punzalan's scholarship on Indigenous community access to digitized archives through virtual reunification has improved archival practices toward more ethical relationships between Indigenous peoples and heritage institutions. He has significantly shaped the field of critical archival studies, community-centered archival practice, and reparative approaches to archives and museums. In 2023, he was inducted as a fellow of of the Society of American Archivists, the highest honor bestowed on individuals by SAA for outstanding contributions to the organization and to the archives profession. I'll pass it over to you, Ricky.
Thank you, Megan. If you are in the Philippines, good evening. And if you are somewhere in the United States and elsewhere, perhaps good morning or wherever you are. I hope you're having a great day. I'm currently in Baguio, where it's raining a lot, and but nevertheless, I have a beautiful scenery of the mountains in the Philippines. Before we begin, I'd like to introduce our panelists. This is going to be a conversation of colleagues across disciplines and areas, all connected by their interest, scholarship, and work pertaining to the Manuel Quezon papers. And this is quite auspicious because this is I think, the 140th birth anniversary of the former president. Our first speaker is Dr. Francis A. Gealogo. He is Horacio de la Costa S.J. Professor of History and former chair of the Department of History at the Ateneo de Manila University. He obtained his bachelor's degree in history cum laude, master's degree in history, and doctoral degree in Philippine studies from the University of the Philippines, Diliman. He was a Fulbright Senior Fellow at the Center for the History of Medicine at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor and was a René Descartes Senior Fellow for History and Philosophy of Science and the Humanities at the Utrecht University, Netherlands. He served as editor of the Diliman Review and managing editor of Philippine Studies, Historical and Ethnographic Viewpoints, and was Associate Director for Research at the Ateneo Institute of Philippine Culture. He is currently the Chair of Ibon Board of Directors, Chair of the Lila Pilipina Support Foundation Board of Directors, Chairman of ACT Teachers Party List, and lead convener of Tanggol Kasaysayan, an organization of historians, researchers, and professors of history campaigning against negative historical revisionism. Our next speaker is Veronica Sison. Um, Born and raised in the paddy fields of central Luzon, Veronica is currently pursuing a Ph.D. in the Department of South and Southeast Asian Studies at UC Berkeley, where her research focuses on the history of the Philippines and of Southeast Asia with an emphasis on knowledge production during the region's Cold War era. Before attending UC Berkeley, she studied history at the University of the Philippines, Baguio, and Diliman campuses. Veronica has worked as researcher for the Carlos Bulosan Museum project of the municipality of Binalonan, Pangasinan from 2018 to 2021, and as an overseas research assistant for the Reconceptualizing the Cold War project on-the-ground experiences in Asia under Professor Masuda Hajimo of the National University of Singapore in 2020. She was also a Cold War archives Research Institute Fellow at the Wilson Center's Public Policy and History program from 21 to 22. In her free time, Veronica enjoys biking, hiking, and taking long afternoon naps in that order. I'd like to aspire to that, Veronica. And finally, our third speaker is Fe Angela Manansala Verzosa. She has 40 years spent uh, a career as an organizer of heritage collections, particularly the papers of Philippine presidents Quezon, Laurel, Quirino, and Garcia, and special collections such as the Carlos Romulo papers, the Hook Balahap records, and the Lorenzo Tañada collections, among many others, at the De La Salle University Repository. She's a graduate of AB History and a master's degree in library science at the University of the Philippines, Diliman. She took up graduate training courses in archival management at the Modern Archives Institute in Washington, D.C., and modern librarianship at the University of Wales in Aberystwyth, United Kingdom, thus contributing to her expertise in the twin areas of archiving and librarianship. Known for her reputational leadership, having served as president of two national professional organizations of librarians, namely the Philippine Librarians Association Incorporated, or PLI, and the Philippine Association of Academic and Research Librarians, or PAARL. She has she was honored with the 2006 Outstanding Professional Librarian Award given by the Philippine Regulation Commission, PAARL's Academic Librarian of the Year in 1996, Tagahabi ng Kasaysayan Centennial Award, and Lifetime Achievement Awards by PLI and PAARL, and the UPLI Alumni Association Award for her exemplary achievements in the advancement of her profession. Retired as former library director and university archivist of De La Salle University, she remains a lifetime member of the DLSU Faculty Association, where she was ranked associate professor. Appointed as temporary historiographer for this joint microfilming project of the National Library of the Philippines and the University of Michigan, Fe Angela Manansala is the only survivor of the team that worked on the 2-year project. Dr. Serafine D. Quiazon, then National Library Director, passed away in 2016, while Isagani Medina passed away in 2004. Miss Ursula Villarino left the project a year after the project began, leaving only Fe Manansala Verzosa to complete it in September 1969. So there you go. Uh, you know, um, we have a good set of speakers. And I've always framed this conversation as, kwentuhan among colleagues, sharing of stories, so to speak. So I'd like to, encourage the speakers to ask questions as well, and also ask clarificatory points amongst each other, so forth and so on. So I see myself as merely asking the first questions, and then we can proceed as we go. So I guess understanding that we have a diverse audience tuned in today. We have Filipinos in the Philippines as well as in the diaspora. Also, students, historians, archivists, and librarians. So, a wide range of viewers or listeners. For the benefit of our younger and also non Filipino audiences who might have limited familiarity with Manuel L. Quezon, my first question is more on asking you how you'd introduce Manuel Quezon, this towering figure in Philippine history. I guess I'll start with Francis because he's, the historian in the group.
Yeah, I may be the odd person out in this uh, very honorable panel of archivists and librarians. But Manuel Quezon was, as you mentioned, a towering figure in Philippine political history. But maybe we can also contextualize um, his period and his presidency of the Commonwealth as part and parcel of a very long, what one may consider the longue durée of Philippine colonial history. And Quezon was somewhat instrumental in defining the impact and the consequences of that colonial history. Um, Coming from the remaining years of the Spanish colonial administration, he served as initially a revolutionary middle-ranking officer of the revolutionary movement against Spain. But when the Americans came, he became one of those prominent politicians who were integrated into the uh, political establishment coordinated by the Americans. He became one of the early leaders of the American-sponsored legislature called the Philippine Assembly, eventually becoming a national figure, uh, becoming Senate President, President Commissioner, and eventually Commonwealth President. But what I think should be remembered of Quezon was his impact in terms of how local and national leaders interacted with one another. Because coming from provincial town in Tayabas, now Quezon Province, he rose to prominence as a national figure, eventually becoming a top political figure um, in Philippine colonial politics. Um, so that particular context somewhat defined and determined the contours of Philippine political history, even post-Quezon period. How the national leaders were reacting with or coordinating with what's going on in the localities, in the provinces, in the countryside, and vice versa. No, what some historians would rather conveniently call as the patron clientelist relations between and among the local elites. Somehow, Quezon was instrumental in defining that era, and somewhat that particular relation between local and national leadership resonated even the post-Quezon, post-war era. So maybe we can leave it at that, and Ma'am Fe may also add to some of the information regarding Quezon or Veronica. Oh, by the way, congratulations. This is just, an appreciation of how representative the generations were in terms of scholarship and production and the use of the Quezon papers.
Yeah, thank you. Who'd like to follow? How would you introduce Manuel Quezon to this diverse audience? Perhaps I can't remember the order, but probably Faye, would you like to say something?
Among all the presidents whose papers I have organized, I find MLQ as the most colorful. And his papers definitely are the most interesting. As you can see, having spent 13 years organizing Laurel papers, you wouldn't want to call Laurel as, he's not in the caliber of Quezon when it comes to being colorful. The the character and personality will not describe Laurel. And so with Quirino, and of course, Garcia. So among all those presidents I have dealt with and whose papers I know, there would be controversial and very interesting aspects of their lives, I find MLQ as really on the top of my list as the most colorful character in among our leaders in history. And he had many firsts. Of course, he was the first president to be elected in a national plebiscite. Elected as unlike Aguinaldo, he was elected to govern the entire country. And then he was the first president, the first Senate president, should I say, to become a president. There were many after him who became president, but he was the first. He was also the first majority floor leader. And, I forgot a first. He was the first president to deliver the first SONA. We always look forward to the State of the Nation address of our presidents. So he was the first. And then, of course, Quezon has many legacies. Right now, aside from being named as the named as a province, a major capital city, there were many cities and streets and parks named after him. We remember him every day because he's on our 20 peso bill. And now he has the face of the largest coin in our history, the 20 peso coin, which was, I think, issued in before the pandemic, 2019. Only, huh? And then, of course, he's the father. He's known as the father of the national language because it was during his time when he promoted Tagalog as our national language. So every kid knows him as ask any kid in school right now, and they will only tell you that he's the father of the national language. So I guess that's it.
Thanks, Veronica. How about you? How would you introduce Manuel Quezon to this audience?
Yeah, I have like a very long answer if that's okay with everyone, and I will also try to share like some slide just in case. Is it visible?
Yeah,
This
it's very visible. Yeah.
okay. So I will tackle, I suppose, this issue from the perspective of Southeast Asian studies, and my interest in the Quezon paper actually began with my research when I was still a master's student at the Department of History at UP. And my broad research question back then was like, how did the Cold War shape the way we write history, at least within Philippine studies? And I look into it during the rise of area studies and later on the crisis period, like around the Vietnam War. So I am interested in this knowledge production and the infrastructure behind it. And because scholarship also depends on like which sources are acquired, like which collections are organized, which documents are microfilmed, and which archives become accessible to particular community scholars. Quezon paper became like a very important like project within this area studies in the US. So I first encountered Quezon papers. Well, we all know like Quezon is like a towering figure. And I realized that it's not something that, just occurred in a vacuum. It's something that was reproduced across time by a particular generation of scholars. So I first encountered the Quezon papers through a generation of Southeast Asianist or Philippine studies specialists who wrote their dissertations in the 1960s and 70s. Like the focus of like their research was like surprisingly focused on Quezon. And I followed their citations, their work, and their scholarship. And the Quezon papers kept showing up. So it led me to like kind of examine the rise of this type of scholarship and what kind of research they prioritize. Um, so now the Quezon papers are important in the Philippine studies for like a very straightforward reason, and my answer to that is because of the sheer amount of scholarship produced from that collection. And these include works that help define how generations of scholars like understood Philippine political history, colonialism, nationalism, and state formation. So I can uh, put a caveat here that I haven't done like a full digital humanities mapping or anything like that of like these scholars' work. What I'm working more is like interpretative, like the structure of their argument, tracing their citations, acknowledgement, etc. So now I'm gonna go back to like who are these area specialists who actually focus their research on Quezon papers. So my story started with this professor at the University of Michigan back in the 1960s, and his name is Professor David Joel Steinberg. So he was hired fresh from his PhD at Harvard, and he specialized on like the Philippine collaboration in the Second World War in the Philippines. So if you can see here, there's Steinberg. He's very influential, at least for Southeast Asian studies, because they produced this landmark work titled In Search of Southeast Asia, which was like the definitive work of the region's history around that time. And so he collaborated with other area studies specialists who conducted their own work in Indonesia, like John Smale, Woodside, Chandler, Wyatt, etc. So David Steinberg is the guy who's pointing at the Philippines on this photo. And another person who's also involved in like I mean this is something that probably the Bentley Library knows. His name is Robert Warner, and Warner was apparently the classmate of David Sturtevant, college classmates. That's why when they found out that, there's a possibility of like working on microfilming Quezon papers, Robert Warner immediately reached out to David Sturtevant, who was then working on his research, which would culminate in this book, like Popular Uprisings in the Philippines. So there's like this like deep relationship among scholars who are involved in the project, which is very interesting, at least within my research. So other American-based area study scholars who used the papers extensively were also like Theodore Friend, Alfred McCoy, John Larkin, Peter Stanley. Where's the photo of Theodore Friend? So that's Professor Theodore Friend. And then I think almost everyone is familiar with Peter Stanley's work, A Nation in the Making. So they're like primarily male scholars of that generation. Well, it's also very contextual, but I'm not gonna look into that. So their works address, different subject matters, but if we zoom out a bit, these scholars actually help, establish some of the major questions that shape, post-war Philippine historiography. So another question that I wanted to like ask myself, how am I supposed to like introduce this? And part of the reason why I wanted to say that there's like a deeper history to this is because the history of knowledge production is also a history of material acquisition, and and part of the reason why Quezon was pretty much accessible to the scholars was because of Michigan, but at the same time because of the historical context where when it was produced. So why did it become so important to a generation of area study specialists? And my answer to that is one reason was simply because it was a different historical context. Today we may encounter like a catalog collection and assume that its organization was already there, but no, it was actually from the very effort of librarians and activists who made that collection possible. So in the 1960s, like Manfei generation, the 1960s and 70s, much of this like archival knowledge was still, being reassembled, and the National Archives was moving its, documents from the Bilibid to Calao, and lots of documents had to be rescued, relocated, sorted, copied, and so on and so forth. So 1960s and 70s was really a period not only of writing like pioneering history of like presidents, but also like the active reordering of archival foundations in Philippine history, plus the invention of microfilming technology. So these two coincided and became like something very special around that time that made this particular type of scholarship possible. And before Quezon paper, one of the earliest attempts also to microfilm documents to be transported to the US was with Edgar Wickberg's copies of Chinese mestizo papers, which is now at UC Berkeley. And I think this was the pioneering work in trying to microfilm like a collection in the Philippines and bring it to the US. But it's Quezon Papers that successfully established this kind of like partnership with the local institution. Um, and then I think another part of like the reason why is this scholarship was kind of important around that time is because it the kind of intellectual trend was matched with this archival expansion project in the US. And one big project was among area study specialists was the study of Philippine political institutions and political behavior, which was briefly mentioned by Professor Gealogo. Scholars around that time were basically trying to figure out how the colonial state actually worked and how political elites accumulated power and, like why patronage, factionalism, and the spoil system became so durable in the first place. And this was like the kind of like scholarly trend that they had followed like in the 1950s and 60s. And the Quezon papers or Quezon himself was especially useful for these questions because they gave honestly, an unusually detailed view of political negotiation during American colonial and Commonwealth periods. So they let historians look not just at like formal institutions, but also at the personal correspondence, rivalries, and day-to-day calculations through which these institutions actually function. And a second trend that made Quezon a very special uh, figure here is because more or less um, there was like a move towards like what John Smale called autonomous history around that time, and this was like a particular scholarship within area studies in its effort to write Southeast Asian history within from within the region's own historical experience, or what they call us like from the indigenous point of view. So instead of treating Southeast Asians as just passive objects of Western actions, Quezon papers became a good resource material for a Filipino elite point of view. And before this shift, scholars working on American colonial period tended to rely heavily on the records of American administrators, and the Quezon papers, in a way, complemented this offering by offering us the perspective of a Filipino political leader negotiating with colonial officials, domestic rivals, and it's also a good resource material on how, like, a Filipino political elite navigated, in a sense, help construct the colonial and post-colonial state. I can discuss more, but I will stop here because there will be lots of questions, and I can, like, share more later.
Thank you, Veronica, for that. That's really good, and comprehensive overview of the kind of not just Quezon, but the intellectual history of what we know about uh, this historical figure. So I think I want to move the conversation towards more about the microfilming project, because this is like the main crux of our conversation this evening or this morning for those who are in Ann Arbor. So I have a direct question to Faye, which is, could you give us an overview of the microfilming project? Because, you were really deeply involved, in the project. What were your most important lessons, in processing the Kazan papers for microfilming in the late 60s and early 70s? And I believe you have a PowerPoint that I'd like to
Yes, please do
share. Yes.
share.
Let's see. Can you see it?
Yep.
Mhm.
Yes.
Okay.
Let me start with this statement, which I forgot to mention when I introduced MLQ at the beginning. One of his, and not many people really realize this, is that this president to this day is the only Philippine president to formally bequeath his official, private, and personal papers to his country. And this remains a unique aspect of his legacy. Manuel Luis Quezon formally donated his papers to the Philippine government through his last will and testament executed in Del Monte, Bukidnon on March 26, 1942. Can we have the first slide? From the account of Dr. Theodore Friend, he described two transfers of the presidential papers of Quezon in his book Between Two Empires. But according to Librado Rodriguez, who was then the records officer of the National Library, then known as the Bureau of Public Libraries, there were 4 transfers. When Quezon left to be exiled for his government to organize his government in exile in Washington, D.C., he left all his papers in Malacanang basement. And between 1943 to 1947, these papers suffered from massive floods which inundated the palace before they were transferred to the old Bilibid prison in Oroquieta. And this was after the war, while the government was waiting for the new legislative building to be constructed. From there, from Oroquieta, the papers were transferred to the new legislative building in 1950 before they were again transferred to the Bureau of Public Libraries at the Arlegui compound in 1955. The next slide will describe, can we see the next slide? Will describe the papers as seen by Dr. Theodore Friend, and which he described in his book Between Two Empires. The status and condition of the papers were very vividly described by Dr. Friend. He says, and I quote, "When I examined it in 1957 to 58 in the Bureau of Public Libraries," he refers to the Arlegui compound, "it consisted of 36 4-drawer filing cabinets and 6 7-foot bookcases, 40 of which were in Spanish and a small amount in Tagalog and other indigenous languages, the rest in English." Furthermore, he is quoted as saying, "They were in furious disorder. Many papers have been destroyed or lost in transfer, and many of those which survived were blackened and compressed in lumps, partially eaten by white ants, or were simply degenerating as poor paper in tropical conditions." Next slide, please. Between 1962 to 1966, the papers were housed on the 4th floor of the present National Library building, which was completed in 1962. The papers were then housed at what we now called the Quezoniana Room. When we arrived in 1967 to work on the papers, little was done to organize them except for 20% of the collection, which was focused on the family correspondence and newspaper clippings. So about 80% remain unprocessed. By 1966, according to the report made by Dr. Isagani Medina for the National Library Director, he mentioned the papers were roughly sorted out by year, although a few remained in archival bundles, wrapped in craft paper and tied loosely, carelessly by string. In the register to the MLQ papers, it was described that the papers were about 259 cubic meters. If you picture in your mind 36 filing cabinets, AI would tell you that these 36 filing cabinets would roughly consist of about more or less 600 documents, 600 items. But in the register, it was described only as about 259 cubic meters and roughly about 180,000 items. So from there, you can surmise that the papers, the content, the massive collection was quite reduced in size to maybe less than a half, maybe even less than one half. And that was due to the 4 transfers made during the lifetime of the papers. Anyway, let's go to the next slide, please. In 1967, the National Library undertook a joint project with the University of Michigan, and funding was approved at $10,000 or roughly 32,000 pesos then to process and eventually microfilm only the meat of the collection. The terms of agreement were made in a MOA signed by the director, then Dr. Serafin Di Quezon, and for the University of Michigan by Dr. Robert Warner. Part of the agreement was for the National Library to retain the negative copy, while 2 positive copies were to be sent to the University of Michigan, and another copy was to be kept by the UP Main Library. The University of Michigan appointed Dr. Isagani R. Medina, probably because he was an alumnus, to lead the project, while the National Library appointed 2 research assistants who were then fresh graduates to assist him, and namely me and Ursula Villarino. Work began in September 1967. Next slide, please. In 1967, when I arrived to work on the papers were already moved from the Quezoniana to the Rare Books and Manuscripts room of the Filipiniana Division on the 3rd floor. And we proceeded to organizing them into 4 record groups, or what we call series. 1, the family correspondence and related material. And as the record group suggests, consists mostly of family materials, ranging from 1918 to 1941. The bulk of what we organized was the general correspondence series. Documents mostly all kinds of communication between Quezon and his correspondence on matters relating to, at the time, to the day-to-day operation of his activities, starting from 1909, when he became resident commissioner, until he became president of the Commonwealth in 1935, until the government in exile, or even before the government in exile was organized in 1942. The third record group was called Speech, Article, and Book File, for short. And this consisted mostly of speeches, articles, statements, reports, and the manuscripts, the handwritten, typewritten, near print, drafts of his book, The Good Fight. The documents span 1910 to 1940. And then the last series or record group is called General Miscellany. Mostly documents from 1907 to 1944, which do not relate to the 3 other series. That's why we place them all under General Miscellany. The papers were sorted by year and later processed based on this series arrangement. The papers of Quezon, after his death in 1944, were, I forgot to mention this, were incorporated with the bulk of his collections before they were transferred to the National Library. It was during that time, in 1957 to 58, when Dr. Friend was introduced to the papers, that the bulk of the collection already included the government in exile documents. Next slide, please. As a result of this 2-year project, sometime in August, I started sending the microfilm reels to University of Michigan. A total of 54 reels were completed, and they contained only those that were, by agreement, selected because of their high research value. And at the outset, let me say this, only 1/4 of the entire collection was microfilmed. The general correspondence, boxes 37 to 56, the major correspondence file, which originally was part of the general correspondence, but we decided to arrange these sub-series differently, because the general correspondence was arranged strictly by chronological arrangement. So the major correspondence file became sort of like case files, communications between Quezon and major correspondence, mostly people who were political leaders at the time, business leaders at the time, and very known people at the time. These were major correspondents with whom Quezon regularly sent and received mail. And most of the materials in this file were considered important, but we could not put them under the general correspondence series because they did not involve the day-to-day. They were not associated with the regular functions of the office that Quezon at the time held. And then the third, which were microfilmed, were the speech article and book file, boxes 71 to 9. I think there were about 57 boxes all in all. And when I refer to boxes, they are archival boxes, what we call banker's box, sized 10-inch by 12 by 15, and each box would be containing something between 2,000 to 3,000 pieces of documents. Those left out were the family papers, the minor correspondence file. We called the minor correspondence file from the general correspondence, like the major correspondence file, because these were communications between Quezon and lesser correspondents. So they were of minor importance. And generally, the matters discussed in those communications were not really significant. Then, of course, the general miscellany boxes 101 to 201, which unfortunately contained the subject file. All of these, including the boxes of additional boxes from the speech article and book file, which contained only duplicates, were left out from the microfilm version. So, in essence, those that appeared in the microfilm version and now available online through this digitized version consist only of 1/4 of the entire collection. Is there more after this slide? Well, okay. Now, let me, I think I have more or less discussed some of the issues we encountered in the process of organizing the papers. The very first real issue was the pitiful condition of the papers. As described by Dr. Friend, it was really, some of the papers were really so difficult to read that we had contracted 4 clerk typists to do the typing, preparation of true copies of the hardly legible documents. And if you see the digital version online now, you will see that some of the materials you will find would have some annotations like this is only a true copy of the original. Meaning the original would be shown, but you could hardly read the original. So many of those documents, particularly in the 1929 to the later period, consisted mostly of illegible documents that needed retyping. And then another factor causing so much delay was the decoding work done on the documents from 1911 to 1930s. These mostly were cablegrams, telegrams, radiograms, wherein Quezon and his correspondents used codes. Why did they use codes? Because some of the documents were so sensitive from from the time he was resident commissioner, when he would be communicating to Osmeña and the other political leaders, he would use this code to prevent, you know, people who shouldn't be reading his communications. So the sensitivity of the content necessitated doing a lot of these communications in code. And we, in the process of processing, we discovered 4 code systems used. Actually, Dr. Cullinane, I think, mentioned 5, but essentially, we identified the 4 codes as the Union Telegraph Code, the War Department Code, the Peterson Code, and a unnamed private code between Quezon and Osmeña between 1911 to 1914. Another challenge, of course, and I think I've mentioned this, was funding was so limited that the microfilming could only be done for the meat of the collection. So we had to gather only those considered of high research value, so we would be able to meet the funding needs. Staffing also was reduced after 1 year because Ursula Villarino left for a training grant, and unfortunately she never returned. And Dr. Isagani Medina, the head of the team, was only on sabbatical leave at the time from UP Main Library in Diliman. So in June, he left the project to return to his post at the UP Main Library. So that left only me to work on the project until it was finished in another year's time. I added this particular event, 2 powerful earthquakes in April 1970 and in April also 1972, which caused heavy damage on the National Library building because it, I mentioned this because it amplifies my or our regret that we did not microfilm the entire collection, because when these earthquakes happened, the shelves on the rare books and manuscripts room, no, they did not collapse. They just toppled, and through all the documents, they were in boxes na uncovered. So they threw the documents in this array again, and I don't know how the staff who succeeded after me were able to restore the documents back to their original boxes. I don't know how they would be doing that because they were not familiar with the way the documents were organized. So the microfilmed version was easier. Many researchers and scholars who worked on the papers found this to be true. Only the microfilm version was, facilitated research because the order where in the documents were organized retained its integrity.
Okay.
Very sad, huh?
Very sad.
In hindsight, I still think we should have microfilmed the entire, even the family papers, even if the family papers, half of them were just receipts and financial, of the financial nature, records of financial nature, to any archivist, and even scholars, they would find interesting tidbits of information, even from family papers, I'm sure. So,
Yeah. Thank you for that. As an archivist, I'm quite fascinated by this historical perspective and context on like the processing of the papers. And my next question actually, I think is will heavily draw on like this question of access and accessibility and the conditions of the papers. And this question is specific to Dr. Gealogo, which is more around as a scholar, as a historian, his use of the Quezon papers, despite the conditions that Faye was describing. How have you used the papers in your own research?
Well, thanks, Ricky. By the way, just some words of appreciation to Veronica and Ma'am Fe, no? Because somehow it felt really nostalgic listening to their stories. I was a student of both Drs. Quiason and Medina as a graduate student at UP Diliman in history in the late 80s, early 90s, before they retired eventually from active professorial duties. And somehow the presentation resonated some of the questions, no, that my former professors and my own experiences somehow defined my approach to the Quezon papers and the other archival or library sources. And that is really a very good lesson in historiography, because historians would really like to capture what happened in the past and toto. But we are limited by the sources. And the sources cannot really provide what we want to write about, or somehow define what we have to write, because we cannot force the sources to write for us or to give information that's not there. So the very evolution of the Quezon papers, for example, as discussed by Ma'am Fe, somehow gave us the lesson that what historians are dealing with are actually snapshots of what previously was defined and determined not by the events, but by the recording of the events themselves. No? So we have the Quezon period, a very long period in Philippine political history, and we have the sources of the Quezon papers as originally deposited in Malacanang, and then what survived in the floods and the wars and the others transferred to Bilibid is just a portion of that papers, which is a portion of the experience of the Quezon period. And what eventually survived in all of these devastations and sorting and organizing is not the entire Quezon paper itself, no? But as Mamfe mentioned, just half of was cataloged. And eventually, half of that half was microfilmed, and that's what we are talking about now. And that's just one of the first take, no? Maybe we can also appreciate the context upon which all of these evolutions of the conditions of the Quezon papers, together with the other sources in Philippine historiography, has come about. No, I mean, we can appreciate, for example, the efforts made by Manfe, Dr. Medina, Dr. Quezon of the 60s and 70s. But remember also the 60s and 70s was also the period from a Filipino historian's perspective, the idea of the birthing of what one may consider as nationalist historiography, uh, putting forward, as Veronica mentioned, the indigenous, the local voice, and the Quezon papers was indicative of that attempt, no, to make available sources in Philippine history and historiography that will amplify local voices. But the 60s and 70s also found it essential for us to rediscover our own history from our point of view. I was struck by what Veronica showed us, and in the slides, and I have a copy of that book when all of these white Anglo-Saxon male historians were trying to point an area in Southeast Asia as if it's their area, and the female voice was lost, the indigenous voice was lost, the local voice was lost. So it's another way of, regaining our own historiography from a local voice, but by looking at these, no? So if we are looking at, for example, everyday history, history from below, social history, national history from a nationalist or from a local perspective, then we can also sort of subvert the very use of that voice and that history by looking at the Quezon, at materials like the Quezon papers from a different perspective. When Ma'am Fe mentioned, oh, we have decided that these are the major correspondence and the other ones are minors. No, these are important documents, and perhaps we can consider the others as less significant, less important. And the question raised by Veronica here, no, in terms of uh, archival collections being sort of gate kept by the librarians and the archivists that defined what is significant and what's not significant. No? It's also a case in point in dealing with how historiography is to be well taken. No? So the history of social movements and the mass movements of the 60s and 70s somehow resonated that interest in research, that even a political figure, a local political figure, a colonial oligarch like Quezon, and the papers that he was able to produce can still yield some significant information if viewed from the history from the below, history from the everyday life, social history, and local history. Sorry, that's a very long introduction. No? Because my research interest as a social historian is really that. No, I served. I was a student of Medina and Quezon and some other prominent Filipino historians like Bernardita Churchill, Milagros Guerrero, Napoleon Casambre, Bonifacio Salamanca, and they were always pinpointing, if I am writing about the 1920s and the 1930s, I should go to uh, the Quezon papers. And lo and behold, I went. No. But not looking at the prism or the perspective of the oligarch, the political leader. No. So I tried to look at not the major correspondences in the original, no, but the minor ones, no, the local voices. I worked as a research assistant of Dr. Digna Apilado. She was writing about the local history of the Ilocos region in the 1920s and the 1930s. No, and Ilocos was, of course, a marginal locale, no, in the world of Quezon. But still, you can find a great deal of voices, if you will, of everyday history in that. No? And then later on, I also dealt with history of social movements, the colorums, the sakdals. Despite the fact that all of these correspondences were between and among the different political leaders, the elites, no, somehow, no, even the correspondence between Benigno Ramos and Manuel Quezon somehow can yield some information on the Sakdalista, for example, or on what's happening from below, no? The peasantry, the women's suffrage campaigns, and other things. No? So you can find the voices of women, of the indigenous, of the local, in utilizing these. No? Despite the limitation, despite the disasters, despite the very own history of the Quezon papers, no? It underwent a very long history by itself. It has its own history, but the history of the everyday, the history of uh, from below, local history, history of women, of peasant rebels, of indigenous peoples can still be located despite the just the one-fourth being microfilmed and eventually now accessible digitally. Perhaps to the researchers out there, we can still find other, you know, gold mines of information, despite the loss of a significant portion of the original papers that reflected the period. And that's, I think, my appreciation to the Quezon papers uh, itself. No, the very fact that it can yield different perspectives, different points of views. No, um, now after the upsurge in the interest in nationalist historiography in the Philippines in the 1960s, 70s, and even up to the 80s, the yearning for, history from the margins, those who were voiceless, powerless, nameless, literally nameless, can really be named by utilizing the Quezon papers. I experienced that because when I was doing some data gathering for Professor Digna Apilado about the local conditions of the Ilocos utilizing the Quezon papers, I found a great deal of local names, not necessarily leaders, no? But those whom we consider as nameless, faceless, those in the margins, can still be named even by utilizing a highly elitist, oligarchic presidential papers like Quezon papers. And I think that's one lesson that should be learned as a value from a historian's perspective. No? That we should never surrender and simply, disregard that, oh, it's an elitist, it's oligarchic, it's a national perspective, leader centric, from the top type of historiography. No, you may uh, have a project that looks at the other side of history, the other side, the underside, as Reynaldo Ileto would like to point out, and still find resonance and significance in a collection like the Quezon Papers. No, so it may be, my personal experiences in the 80s and the 90s as a researcher, and when I went to Michigan, I was telling Ricky, it has been quite a long time. I realized, I went to Bentley long time ago and tried to compare what's in the microfilm then and what we have at UP and what I examined at the National Library, and not only the state of the physical state of the libraries and the collections, and how the librarians were reacting with, the researchers. No, that personal interaction may also be equally significant in narrativizing the experience and the history of the Quezon papers. That's another story, but perhaps Mamfe can also write about that. The librarian researcher relation. But also equally important is how the physical state of this collection, of the libraries or the special collections that house the papers, may also be something worth noting. You know, Sometimes the air conditioning system in the special collections of the Filipiniana in the National Library will break down, and we will all worry about the physical state of the original Quezon papers that were not microfilmed. No, it will definitely be challenging to preserve some of the papers if temperature, humidity, and the like are not controlled. What will happen to them? So what we are being exposed to now, given the digitized version, is just a snapshot of history. But despite that, we can still find the treasure, in that particular snapshot. So going back to my question, who defines what is of value? Who defines what is of significance? I think we are appreciative of the work by the librarians and the archivists, but also the context upon which the people, the scholar, the academic community work, no? The appreciation of the 60s and 70s regarding the papers may be different from the appreciation of the current generation.
Mhm.
So what may be significant to a previous generation, uh, or insignificant to the previous generation may be totally front and center and highly significant to the current generation. No? Ma'am Fe was
Mhm.
mentioning about the receipts, the expenses, and all. No, and that's a dissertation by itself. No, in terms of reconstructing a family history, but that's relegated to a different uh, uh, or state of physical state of the collection, precisely because they were not regarded in the 60s and 70s as a major or significant, and therefore they were not integrated into what may be microfilmed eventually and what we have now. So there's still a need for us to go back to the original National Library uh, paper type of collection. But the digital version will really open the doors to further the access um, of the papers to a larger audience. So, who defines? It's the librarian, the historian, but more importantly, the context of the generation that is doing research on a paper like the Quezon Papers.
Mhm. Well, thank you, Francis, for that. You mentioned, like the importance of access as a historian and the role of librarians and archivists in the process. I have a question specific to Veronica, because you've studied the patterns of access of the microfilm papers between the Bentley and the National Library of the Philippines. How would you characterize the historians' use of the microfilms between these two institutions?
Um, uh, Thank you, Dr. Riki. Yeah, just a minor caveat. I did not do like a thorough like digital humanities mapping. I just
Mhm.
checked like, mostly the acknowledgements and all, and I work with like a particular generation of scholars. So this might not reflect like the contemporary scholar generation, at least within the Philippines, or those working on like local history or like nationalist historiography. And I would like to thank Professor Francis for like that very elaborate, understanding of like of what have been produced by local scholars as well. Because one thing that I did not particularly mention earlier is that there was like a huge tension between these like American-based area specialists and their use of Quezon papers, and also like the nationalist historians based in the Philippines. And the portrayal of this scholarship can be best like read in this is actually illustrated in Ilato's piece, Orientalism and the Study of Philippine Politics and Society. People can check the piece, and then you can see like the different debates surrounding scholarly production in the Philippines, and how politics was read from the area studies point of view. You can read the sources now, like the Quezon papers, and make your own judgment, like like what kind of perspectives have been built across time, like
Yeah.
from like different cohorts. So based on like my study, I I actually noticed that many US-based scholars consulted the microfilm copies at the national libraries instead of like traveling to Michigan. And there is a practical explanation for this, which I can expand on later, and it has something to do with their funding situation. But also consulting the papers locally was, less expensive and more accessible than traveling to the US, when most of them, this particular generation, was forced to relocate to Australia back when there was already a funding drought in area studies in the US in the 1980s. So I can talk more about this, but then I will stop there. And I think, as far as I know, Michigan originally held the exclusive rights to the papers, so the collection could not be readily duplicated and distributed. Besides, like in Bentley or in UP, you can probably explain more about this, Dr. Ricky. So. I think the pattern that I mostly notice among researchers working at the Michigan collection, this is just like a tendency, not really like a, like a formulaic reading of their works. But when scholars working on like the Michigan papers, sorry, on Quezon papers at Michigan, um, when they do their research there, they tend to compare it with the records of American colonial officials. And while those working on the Philippine version, um, place them alongside the papers of other Philippine presidents or like Philippine politicians. So proximity wise, there is a tendency to compare Quezon alongside Manuel Rojas papers or Quirino papers and other like the Philippine insurrection records, the national libraries. So one, I think, example that I noticed, like being what where Quezon paper was used alongside Manuel Rojas papers were like the work of Dr. Yusuke Takagi from Tokyo, who tried to reconstruct the history of central banking in the Philippines. And then from Michigan, there was I remember Leah Castañeda Anastasio, who read the Quezon Papers alongside Leonard Wood's diaries and American administrative and constitutional records. There's also work of Professor like Julian Go, who look into the educational institutions, and the one that I was like reading recently was like a good like combination of both sources, like from the NLP, Bentley, like combined together to produce like a creative exploration of like Philippine history. It's like Dr. Mike Pantes, like a capital city at the margins. He used both the NLP, the National Library, and then the Bentley copies together with like other Philippine and Michigan collections, and that is to write like the urban history of Quezon City, which I really enjoyed reading. Uh, I think we can do like more study about this topic, but I also forgot to mention earlier that something that we should also like highlight is Dr. Mila Guerrero's work, who was supposed to be like Steinberg advisee at Michigan, but then because Professor Steinberg left Michigan, Norman Owen, who was also an advisee of Steinberg, became like Dr. Guerrero's advisor, and also Dr. Anita Churchill, who I think the main proponent of the proposal to um, make the Quezon Papers like a UNESCO heritage collection. So the female scholars are like advancing the field, and I think we should probably mention what kind of work they did in order for us to thrive at this like period.
Thank you for that, Veronica. I think I will have to exercise my decision as moderator to skip some questions, because we're bumping towards, like the time allotted for audience questions, and I do want to encourage audience questions. So, I might skip some questions if others don't mind. But I don't want to skip this particular one, which is the and I think partly Francis mentioned this earlier, the relevance of the Casson papers in contemporary audiences. Are there new research uses of the Casson papers, particularly now that we have the digital versions of the microfilm? Yeah, this is for anyone. Francis, would you like to go ahead and expand on like the new research uses? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, of course, the digitization initiative carries with it a new weight for uh, scholars. Now, there's no reason for anybody to say, oh, we were not able to have access to some of the papers because it's available digitally. But I think what's important now is the use of the Quezon papers and other presidential papers, perhaps, no, as rather more introspectively significant and important for us, no, to realize what's going on in the contemporary world. Um, because in my classes, for example, when I was referring to the Osmeña Quezon rivalry, I was not giving any names and we're saying, oh, we have a president and a vice president. They were initially together, united in one team, and then they separated and became rivals, and then they unified again. And the type of patronage politics, bureaucratic capitalism, and all of those social issues and problems that we are confronting now. Uh, I was not referring to the contemporary period, but somehow my students appreciated that we may be discussing Quezon and Osmeña, but somehow our appreciation of what's going on in the present may be informed by what went on in the past. The uh, the rivalries and the negotiations between and among the different groups of political families in the Philippines. No, uh, there are still continuing patterns um, of political structures and socio-economic conditions that remain to be very relevant to the present. Uh, and the use of the Quezon papers and its other um, and the other papers that may be of a similar type may be given more value and weight even now than before. No, the fact that we are asking different types of questions. No, we were we are being forced to look into other conditions and issues that perhaps um, the generation of historians and archivists of the 60s and 70s may not be asking, you know. Um, Ricky, you were mentioning about the heavy rains and the floods. Environmental history is one. History of disaster is one area. That's really very important in the Philippines right now. At face value, we cannot find anything of significance in the Quezon papers. But if you dig deeper into the papers themselves, somehow you can also find some relevant information, no, regarding some of these things. Even the very history of the Quezon papers themselves, no, inundated by floods, disorganized by a series of earthquakes. No, these are
Mhm.
part and parcel of the impact of the history of disasters to knowledge production and intellectual history. And I think
Mhm.
that should also be foregrounded as part and parcel of the narrative, you know.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Francis. I think I have to, in the interest of time, I may need to skip ahead into like our last question, which is like this discussion is inspiring all of us to think about the importance of preserving presidential papers, not just of Quezon, but all other presidents of the country. What are your recommendations to ensure that these records are preserved and accessible for future generations? Now, like I'm asking like a bigger question, not just centered on the Quezon papers, but largely inspired by the fact that these records were preserved. What about other presidents, I guess, is the is the question.
Maybe Mamfe can also elaborate on her experiences on the other presidential papers.
Yes. Momfe, you have to unmute. You have to unmute. Uh, I think we need to unmute her. But I don't know how to do it.
Yeah, it seems like it only will allow me to ask to unmute.
Yeah.
Just press
How
the,
about,
the unmute button, Mang
yeah,
Fe.
The It's at the bottom left, should be.
while she's figuring it out, like how about,
Yeah.
Veronica or Francis
Yeah,
answering the question?
well, there were early attempts, to
Mm.
establish a presidential papers program in the 1960s. Uh, Even earlier than 1960, because I remember the Magsaysay Foundation was beneficiary to a land donation from the government. By virtue of a congressional act, the land on which the Magsaysay Center now stands on, that huge 18-story building, iconic building along Rojas Boulevard, very close to Pedro Hill, was a fulfillment to the obligation of the government to do something about the presidential papers of Magsaysay. There was a series of columns in the Manila Chronicle written by Vicente Albano Pasis, a famous journalist, and his writings uh, were were mostly critical of the inadequate preservation of presidential papers and the treatment made by people who stepped down from Malacanang, like former presidents who took all their papers with them upon leaving Malacanang. So, with these advocacies, it helped in the another congressional act passed in 1968, which authorized the government to donate the land right at the corner of Pedro Hill and Ross Boulevard to the Jose P. Laurel Memorial Foundation. And that is how the foundation was able to uh, fund many of its activities because they rented out space on the ground floor while keeping the entire mezzanine floor to operate a presidential archives library and museum. Now, aside from the Laurel Memorial Foundation, no other strictly private presidential memorial foundations received an identical congressional public land grant since then. So, parang, everything was at a standstill. The government wasn't doing anything much about the presidential papers program that was initially developed into a plan by then National Library Director Serapin D. Quezon, sometime in after the completion of the University of Michigan and National Library project, he he tried to push for his own presidential papers program, but uh, nothing really materialized. In March 1976, I took note of this. He submitted a 25, Director Quezon, submitted a 25-year development plan for 1976 to the year 2000 to include a presidential papers program to be funded by a 2.3 million, which is not really practical, or feasible at that time. And the plan was to include the creation of a presidential papers room at the National Library, the appointment of a program director, the organization and arrangement of presidential collections, the preparation of finding aids, and their eventual microfilming. Nothing happened. And then lately, sometime in 2007, Republic Act 9470, or what you are aware of this, Ricky, huh? The National Archives Act of 2007 established the legal framework for the management, administration, and preservation of Philippine presidential papers. But what has it done since 2007? I'm throwing it back to the other panelists, because right now I don't see much of, I mean, aside from the private initiatives of the heirs of former presidents, let's see, Macapagal, right? Aquino, Cory Aquino, and they have their own private initiatives. They established their own presidential museum. Maybe not. It's not the kind of presidential archives that you would you would want established similar to the U.S. presidential library system, but on their own initiatives, they tried to do that, but to preserve the papers of the former presidents. But considering these private initiatives, nothing is done to make them accessible to the public. Because I think for the Macapagal papers, they were only accessible to the biographers, the official biographers or writers on Macapagal, Diosdado Macapagal. For Marcos, the Marcos Sr., the papers were scattered all over because part of the papers that he brought with the family in Hawaii were captured by the U.S. government. So I'm not sure if the U.S. National Archives would have them, but they would be under strict censorship because under very restrictive access because of the nature of the Marcos, the senior Marcos papers,
They
and
were
then of
not turned
course,
over with PCGG. They're not
yeah,
with the
yeah, and
PCGG.
then the ones in the custody of PCGG, right, right, but they were mostly photo duplicates. The originals
Yeah.
were uh you know supposedly brought to Hawaii.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, after Marcos, we have Fidel Ramos. Now Fidel Ramos also uh the family, the heirs, made their own initiative, but who has had access to Ramos' papers? And then, of course, Estrada. And then, no, before Estrada, Estrada, and then after
Uh,
Estrada, Arroyo. The Arroyo papers are still in the residence of, I think, of Congresswoman GMA right now. So, you know, access to these presidential papers are very, very, very limited, if
mhm.
at all, huh? If at all there is.
Yeah. Yeah. So, Veronica, Francis, would you like to say something about that question, or should we open uh, this conversation to like our wider audience?
I think
Megan, do you have?
Veronica also mentioned a very significant point on the part of scholars and academics, and that is not only the physical or even right now, no, virtual or digital access to these materials, but more importantly, how scholars from various localities are somewhat defined by the funding that they were receiving from the grants and the programs, no? So that some of the research agenda are actually not uh, solely nor exclusively defined by their own research interests, but on the availability of the programs that they were entering into. That's one, no? And therefore some of those, we may be speaking about be, having been a student of the University of the Philippines, having limited access, no? But I can just imagine if you are, a scholar from a far-flung province, no, or a state university elsewhere outside of Manila, it becomes even more problematic to have access to some of the funding grants that may give you access, no, to some of the papers. Um, if you can hurdle that, then you have to contend with what Mamfe was mentioning, no? Whether or not even the very presence of a collection of a presidential paper, no, if you're pursuing a particular topic under a specific presidency, whether it's
Mm.
readily available, that's one. Whether it's organized or publicly accessible, no, that's another thing, you know.
Mhm.
And if you have funding to have access to those materials, that's another thing.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Francis. Megan, do we have questions from the audience that you could?
Yeah, I have a few. If anyone wants to submit additional questions, feel free to do that in the Q&A. So it seems like some of our participants are curious about the political aspects, the sort of world around the collection. And one of the questions that was asked is given the timeline for the Quezon Papers project in the 1960s and 1970s, did President Marcos Sr. have any involvement in the process at all? And if so, what was that involvement?
I guess Manfe would know if former President Marcos Sr. was at all involved.
What was the question, or what was the
I
if
think
he was involved in what?
if he influenced the processing project and the microfilming project originally in the 60s and 70s.
Ah, I wouldn't be privy to that, The terms of agreement were at the time I was doing my master's thesis on the presidential papers. I was able to take a peek into the MOA and the correspondences relating to some changes in the terms of the MOA, but they were kept in the director's office, director's files. And since then, I think they have been so restricted that any inquiry into the terms and agreement regarding the microfilming project would be highly classified. I think, because I myself couldn't get more.
Ma'am Fe, Ricky, can I ask something?
Yeah.
No, Ma'am Fe, I'm just a curiosity, because during almost at the same time, the Tadhana project of the Marcos government was already being implemented. And of course, you have scholars trying to put some of the historical revisionist tendencies of the older Marcos presidency, particularly regarding the Nalundasan case, the World War II medals, and the like. Did you have any particular sense that somehow some of these concerns of history of the former President Marcos, of historical significance, or the creation of a narrative that may reflect his own version of history, did it impact at all on the collections like the Quezon
Not
papers,
not not on the papers of Quezon.
not
Not
on
on
the
the
paper?
papers of Quezon. Any intervention from Marcos at the time would not be, well, justifiable because there would be nothing much to from the Quezon collection. Uh, uh, there would be nothing much to reveal on him or his family's history or concerns. Uh, I think what would that particular question would be more appropriate to the Laurel papers because
Mm,
at the time I was organizing the papers in the late 1970s, from 1975 up to 1982 when we started microfilming them. We even had bomb threats, because I refused to answer phone inquiries about the existence of any nalundasan, any documents pertaining to the nalundasan case. And it
mhm.
was, remember, Laurel, who was then the Chief Justice, who um, dismissed the case in his
Yeah.
favor. He was already in prison. And he even took the bar while he was in prison and passed it with flying colors. And
Mhm.
we had inquiries, phone inquiries, trying to ascertain, confirm, verify whether there were documents we held in custody on not only on the Nalundasan cases, because we have phone inquiries also, mostly phone inquiries. They were not formally submitted to us by written request about some Davao land cases, which also Laurel handled during the time when he was serving as a lawyer to many Japanese
Mm,
business interests in Davao.
yeah.
We even had a whole group record series on the Davao land cases in Mindanao.
Mm,
Um, Also, I think we at the time we were processing the papers, um, we had some inquiries uh, through the director's office passed on to me regarding any material that would help in a biography that was being funded by Malacanang at the time, sometime in 1968. I think Dr. Milagros Guerrero and Dr. Samuel Tan were assigned to do the write up of an authoritative biography of Marcos.
yeah.
I don't know what happened to that, but there were attempts to look into the papers, and then and in not only the Quezon papers or collection, but other collections.
Mm,
And the rumors came out that many of the documents were so-called pilfered out, and somehow lost in transit, and they were never found.
wow. So,
Wow! But we were
Veronica,
very
you
strict,
are
when
laughing,
we were
Veronica.
processing the Quezon papers, we were very strict. We made sure that the scholar or researcher were officially allowed in writing by the director himself. Otherwise, they would not be able to take even a peek into the Quezon collection at the time because we were still processing.
Yeah. Well, to go back to the question on whether Marcos influenced any of the processing or the representation of the collection, Veronica and I probably were one of the few people who looked at the records at the Bentley and the negotiations behind the microfilming. I did not see any kind of sense of any Marcos involvement. A lot of the conversations were mostly, this kind of ambitious ambition by the Bentley and the University of Michigan to be the largest repository of Filipiniana archives. In fact, the at that time there was aspiration to be calling the Michigan Historical Collection as the largest Filipiniana collection. Like you can write Philippine history by consulting, that it's more like that. And then these other historians uh, supporting the project. There's now I can't um, answer whether, for instance, the hiring of Quezon and other people were influenced by Marcos, but none in the records at the Bentley. Faye, you are muted.
Yeah, yes, 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 yes. May I say something? I guess, I suspect that the director, Quezon, I'm referring to, was hired particularly because he was a fraternity brother.
Yeah, so that's the kind of if there's any impact, that's probably the hiring of the director, which up to now, as you know, is a presidential appointee. So,
Yes.
do we have one more question from
We
the
do. I do want to say we've had quite a few great questions. We won't be able to get through all of them, but one that I think is a good wrap up for us is how would the Quezon papers help the current generation, especially Filipino students, in understanding Manuel Quezon himself, and how did the papers help students understanding the current political landscape? Any thoughts on that one?
I think Sir Francis provided like some some of the answers to that. But would you like to say more?
I could ask a different one if there's nothing to add.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, so here's another one related more specifically to the papers themselves. So going back, are there any steps made to reorganize the Kizon papers that are still at the NLP? And if known, are there any current efforts to microfilm the remaining material that's not in the microfilm that the Bentley has recently digitized?
That's a good question for folks at the National Library of the Philippines.
That's fair. That is fair. Okay,
Yeah.
here's one that's a little bit bigger. Um, Do you think it's possible to study the Kazon material, to study Kazon as a person in his own terms, taking into account local perspectives without overlooking authoritarian character in his life?
I don't think we can divorce Quezon from the context of the 1935 Constitution, the authoritarian structures that were born out of the period, and the context that somehow defined and determined the roots of Philippine authoritarianism, which to some historians can be rooted in the Quezon period. And the appreciation really is that historically, Quezon was also himself defined by his own context, no? The way he was uh, regarded by the Americans and the way he regarded the Americans, no, as a leader. And somehow it resonated, no? And going back to the earlier question, it resonated to, for example, how contemporary leaders were reacting with or dealing with American or any foreign institution for that matter, or foreign forces for that matter. How to balance one's political agenda and career on the one hand, and the idea that you are a national public figure and therefore you should represent the interest of the nation. But that idea of what is the interest of the nation, the very notion of nation formation, is also at the heart and the front and center of um, the development of collections, presidential collections like the Quezon Papers. No, it is somewhat related with the idea that nation state formation can be represented through the archives. No? And the Quezon Papers is one of the best and one of the earliest representations of that attempt to define the nation state via the institutionalization of the bureaucracy, the economy, and foreign relations as expressed and located in the presidential papers. And therefore, the need, for example, when Mamfe was discussing about how somewhat relatively problematic the development of presidential papers in the Philippines, the conditions of that development was. Somehow it was problematic, and it reflected the relatively problematic state, of course, of the formation of the Philippine nation state, no, and how knowledge production can best be represented in the presidential papers, and the experience of state formation can somehow also be uncovered in the use of these papers.
Mhm. Yeah, one aspect that we haven't fully discussed, which is like I think a little bit out of the range of our conversation, is the fact that there was kind of exchange between the Bentley and the National Library on the Malcolm papers, basically saying, well, the National Library of the Philippines has the papers of Quezon, but the Malcolm papers are in the possession of the Bentley, in exchange for that kind of microfilming, the National Library of the Philippines actually asked for the Malcolm papers to be microfilmed and be, and thus, the library received the Malcolm papers. So in a way, the relationship of the Quezon papers is not just, the question is not just about other presidents and other, but these other colonial officials, right? For example. So,
The idea of reciprocity, I think, also is equally important
yeah,
in that.
yeah, and the reciprocity also from the angle of knowledge production, like if
Yeah.
they did not have this kind of quid pro quo relationship, which is really interesting to me because now I'm in Baguio and I just realized that Malcolm actually wrote the charter for Baguio. So I was thinking, oh, maybe Baguio needs to have a copy of the Malcolm papers too, because he created the charter. Anyway, just like looking at all those connections. We are 2 minutes into like the end. And Megan, would you like to say something to like finish and end this fantastic panel?
Sure. First of all, I want to say thank you so much to all of our panelists and Dr. Punzalan. We've been getting a lot of great messages from you all in the chat about how much you're appreciating your work, and we really are happy to have your perspectives on these questions. To wrap things up, I will say that this recording will be available after the fact, so you will get a follow-up message in your email that provides some follow-up information and the link once it's ready. It won't be right after this. We have to do a little bit of cleaning up to make sure it's accessible, but you will receive that in your email. And we want to thank you all so much for joining today to talk about this important collection. We hope that you take a look yourself. I will put in the chat a link there to the digital collections in case you want to wrap up this session by exploring some more. Thank you all.
Yeah.